Thank you for coming out to the King's Theatre tonight to see the singular, brilliant Paul Auster. My name is Nora Chassler, and I'm honored to be able to ask him some questions tonight. He's going to start by doing a little reading and end by doing a little reading, but just to kind of give you a little introduction, we're dealing with the Austerverse, as I like to think of it, where I've been for the past 6 weeks, and it's a complex multiverse. And if you wanted to go there, if you wanted to get into all of Paul's works, you'd have to re-examine your attitudes towards life and death, cause and effect. And I highly recommend it. Anyway, he's going to start by reading from his latest novel, which is 4321, which is long listed for the Booker Prize. Shall I explain a little how it works, or do you want to explain the...
Why don't I read the first 2 pages or so?
Okay.
And then we'll start talking.
Okay.
There was the idea of the festival that I read at the beginning, at the end. I'm happy to do it. So I thought, for now, I'll read the first 2 pages of the book, so you get some sense of, I suppose, the tone. And even though the character it discusses makes a quick exit from the story. So this is from chapter 1.0. According to family legend, Ferguson's grandfather departed on foot from his native city of Minsk with 100 rubles sewn into the lining of his jacket, traveled west to Hamburg through Warsaw and Berlin, and then booked passage on a ship called the Empress of China, which crossed the Atlantic in rough winter storms and sailed into New York Harbor on the first day of the 20th century. While waiting to be interviewed by an immigration official at Ellis Island, he struck up a conversation with a fellow Russian Jew. The man said to him, "Forget the name Reznikov. It won't do you any good here. You need an American name for your new life in America, something with a good American ring to it." Since English was still an alien tongue to Isaac Reznikov in 1900, he asked his older, more experienced compatriot for a suggestion. "Tell them you're Rockefeller," the man said. "You can't go wrong with that." An hour passed, then another hour, and by the time the 19-year-old Reznikov sat down to be questioned by the immigration official, he'd forgotten the name the man had told him to give. "Your name?" the official asked. Slapping his head in frustration, the weary immigrant blurted out in Yiddish, "Ich hab vergessen," I've forgotten. And so it was that Isaac Reznikov began his new life in America as Ichabod Ferguson. He had a hard time of it, especially in the beginning. But even after it was no longer the beginning, nothing ever went as he had imagined it would in his adopted country. It was true that he managed to find a wife for himself just after his 26th birthday. And it was also true that this wife, Fanny, née Grossman, bore him 3 robust and healthy sons. But life in America remained a struggle for Ferguson's grandfather from the day he walked off the boat until the night of March 7th, 1923, when he met an early, unexpected death at the age of 42, gunned down in a holdup at the leather goods warehouse in Chicago, where he had been employed as a night watchman. No photographs survive of him, but by all accounts, he was a large man with a strong back and enormous hands. Uneducated, unskilled, the quintessential greenhorn know-nothing. On his first afternoon in New York, he chanced upon a street peddler hawking the reddest, roundest, most perfect apples he had ever seen. Unable to resist, he bought one and eagerly bit into it. Instead of the sweetness he had been anticipating, the taste was bitter and strange. Even worse, the apple was sickeningly soft, and once his teeth had pierced the skin, the insides of the fruit came pouring down the front of his coat in a shower of pale red liquid, dotted with scores of pellet-like seeds. Such was his first taste of the new world, his first never to be forgotten encounter with a Jersey tomato. Not a Rockefeller then, but a broad-shouldered roustabout, a Hebrew giant with an absurd name and a pair of restless feet, who tried his luck in Manhattan and Brooklyn, in Baltimore and Charleston, in Duluth and Chicago, employed variously as a dockhand, an ordinary seaman on a Great Lakes tanker, an animal handler for a traveling circus, an assembly line worker in a tin can factory, a truck driver, a ditch digger, a night watchman. For all his efforts, he never earned more than nickels and dimes, and therefore the only things poor Ike Ferguson bequeathed to his wife and 3 boys were the stories he had told them about the vagabond adventures of his youth. In the long run, stories are probably no less valuable than money, but in the short run, they have their decided limitations. So the book begins.
I wanted to say this is an Edinburgh International Book Festival event in partnership with Edinburgh International Festival and British Council as part of the Spirit of 47 program. So I wanted to say that, so I forgot to say that. My first question is about the festival, and the festival was set up after World War II in a spirit of hope and generosity to celebrate art, to bring artists together, to bring audiences together. The first year, Edinburgh households donated their coal rations to light up the castle. They donated food. Bruno Walter played the piano, and Kathleen Ferrier sang. It was lovely. So I just wanted to quickly read something that you wrote about literature. This is Archie number 4, just to explain what happens a little bit. I need to explain what happens. So in 4321, there's one protagonist, but 4 different fates befall him. So it's one set of genes, and then the sort of epigenetics of fate set in. So he's in different towns in New Jersey, and different things come up. So we follow him through each chapter. We follow 4 different Archies. So this is Archie 4. They all turn out to be writers, but different kinds of writers.
It goes in cycles. So the chapters are 1.0 is the kind of overture to the book, which ends with Ferguson being born. And for several seconds, he's the youngest person on the face of the earth. Then it's 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, etc., through 7 cycles. And I think as a reader, you begin very quickly to distinguish among the different boys. The circumstances are different, and they sort of develop differently.
They do, yeah. So Archie 4, he writes, this is when he first decides to become a novelist. He says, or the narrator says, "Crime and Punishment changed him. Crime and Punishment was the thunderbolt that crashed down from heaven and cracked him into 100 pieces. And by the time he put himself together, Ferguson was no longer in doubt about the future. For if this was what a book could be, if this was what a novel could do to a person's heart and mind and innermost feelings about the world, then writing novels was surely the best thing a person could do in life." And that's not the end of the sentence. He writes these beautiful long sentences. I just wanted to ask if you think, considering how the spirit of the festival started, given where we are today politically, given that we have these 2 toxic narcissists about to start a nuclear war, for example, do you think literature can help? Do you feel the way Archie felt there?
Let's put it this way. In one book I wrote long, long ago, it was one of the volumes in the New York trilogy, I wrote, "Stories happen to the people who are able to tell them," which is a complex idea, but something I actually believe is true. Well, I think the same applies with books. Books happen to the people who are able to read them. Now, unfortunately, most people in the world can't read books or don't read books. But the people who do care about books, books can have an enormous impact in the same way that Crime and Punishment had on Ferguson as a young person. Books can turn us inside out. Books can change the way we think about the world. Books, I think, at their best, and by books we're talking about novels, I think can give us a sense of connectedness to other people. Because really, when you think about it, the novel is in itself a democratic act. The novel, as it's developed, is about individuals, often the most ordinary individuals. You know, literature in the past was about kings and princes and gods, but the novel is about ordinary people, people like us. And in order to be able to read a novel fully, you have to enter into the consciousness of someone who is not yourself. And that act alone is the first step towards, I think, encompassing a greater human community that which you feel part of. And I think that's what books can do for us. They make us feel connected to other people. And I think at the extreme of what books can do, they can make us more compassionate.
Yeah, it sounds like you were describing they
Yeah.
can basically create empathy and
Yes.
teach empathy.
Yes.
But that's an interesting idea about sort of what different types of people there are. So I wanted to ask you, if we were to use the conceit of 4, 3, 2, 1, and say that you were Paul Auster 4, what events do you think were crucial, into making you this successful author, worldwide acclaim? You're married to the brilliant essayist, novelist, interdisciplinary in Surrey Hoostby. Your daughter is well-known singer-songwriter. What happened to make you Paul Auster 4?
This family of artists. Well, I'll tell you, it's not an autobiographical novel.
I know.
Ferguson is not me, but I do borrow certain things from my life. And I think in particular, in general, that makes a lot of sense. I would say that overall, I take my own geography and my own chronology. So Ferguson is pretty much my age. He grows up in the places where I grew up, and he lives in cities where I have lived. But other than that, we're not the same. But I did read Crime and Punishment at 15, and I did have that revelation. I cared a lot about books. I was always reading, even as a small child, even writing from around the age of 9. God knows why. My parents were not educated. Neither one went to college, university. We had no books in the house. But I would go to the public library in my little town and bring books back. And I started writing these stupid stories in the style of Robert Louis Stevenson when I was about 10 or 11, or Edgar Allan Poe. Those are the people I liked the best then. And at 15, I read Dostoevsky, and it had the most enormous impact on me. It literally did turn me inside out, and I felt as if a great big rock had fallen on my head and re-altered everything inside my brain. And it was at that moment I said, this is what I want to do. I want to write books. I want to be able to touch people in the way I'm touched by this extraordinary novel. So that is part of it. And I think I knew what I wanted to do early, which is lucky. Most kids don't. But I was lucky. But my progress was very slow. I was not precocious the way the Ferguson boys are. They're all precocious. This is something
That's
to be
interesting,
noted
because
about
I
them.
did notice. I thought,
Yes.
God, they're also driven.
They're doing
They really-
things at a very young age. And
Yeah.
Ferguson 4, the one who's had this insight at 15, and who does eventually become a novelist, is so much more dedicated than I was as a
That's
young person.
fascinating.
And I want to read, the last thing I'll read is about the disciplines he imposes on himself as a teenager, trying to turn himself into a writer. But that wasn't me.
Okay.
I was floundering about. I wrote poems. I wrote short stories. Some of them were better than others. I think, generally speaking, they were all pretty terrible. But I think becoming a writer is a matter of will as much as anything else. You decide you want to do it, and you keep hacking away at it, trying to become better. And it's this desire, coupled with, I think, a certain kind of hardness about what you're doing. So to be able to understand that it's not good enough yet, it doesn't measure up, you have to get better.
I wonder if there's something sort of American about that sentiment, because I wanted to actually ask about the American dream, so-called, which I had forgotten about. And then when I was reading, when I went back through your novels, I noticed something, which was that crazy things happen with money. There are always inheritances and cash windfalls, and kind of money is like, what happened? You know, it's in a trunk, it's in a freezer, it's thrown up in the air. But then in contrast, you have characters working really hard to almost remove money, like Marco in Moon Palace. He gets rid of everything, waltz training, and with Master Yehudi, it even happens kind of with the wall.
You've done your homework.
Yes,
this is
I have.
Impressive. Yes.
It happens with the wall and music of chance, but it did make me think there's this contrast. There's money, which almost seems like, I don't know, not a grace, but it's just sort of thrown at people occasionally. And then there's this concentrated hard work, moral work, that's the opposite of remunerated. They don't get anything for it. So I was wondering, what does this say about your relationship to success and money in the American
You've put your
dream?
finger out a really interesting question, and no one has ever asked me this. So let me try to think of an answer for you. Because it's really a deep, deep subject. I grew up with two parents who didn't really get along. It was a terrible marriage, and it eventually ended in divorce when I was a teenager. When I was about 17, they finally split up. And my response was one of enormous relief. Unlike a lot of kids whose parents get divorced, were traumatized by it, I felt liberated by it, because I was living with these two people who had nothing in common. Now, both of them were children of the Depression, but my father was older than my mother by about 12 or 13 years. So he was born in 1912. In other words, when the Depression hit in 1929, he was 17. So he never went to college, as I said. He started his working life during the greatest economic disaster in American history. And he came from this poor immigrant family. He was one of 5 children, the youngest. As you know from The Invention of Solitude, his mother murdered his father, my grandfather, and it was a miserable childhood, spent in such penury that my father became obsessed with money and became a skinflint. I mean, when he did better in life, he just didn't want to spend money. He couldn't do it. So there was that side. And then my mother, who was born in 1925 and came from less traumatic backgrounds, loved spending money. It was a great joy for her. She was one of the original American consumers. And I write about this in Hand to Mouth, which is an autobiographical book. I could see the almost erotic joy that would go into her eyes when all the goods at the supermarket were, being put in the basket and the cash register was ringing. It gave her a thrill. And she was extremely generous and loved things. So they were absolute opposites. Now, I grew up at a moment when my father was, he was never rich. He made it into the middle class, and we were, as they say, comfortable. I never had to worry about eating. I never had to worry about having clean clothes or food. I mean, all the terrible things that children are subjected to, I was spared. But I grew up, for some reason, from around the age of 10 or 11, I hated American middle-class life. I hated the focus on money. I hated this whole culture of greed and of conspicuous consumption. And I became a kind of ascetic very early. And I made up my mind, I didn't want things. I didn't want this. I didn't want to live this way. I thought this was a way to die a death by the time you're 30 years old. Your body might go on breathing, but you'd be dead. And I didn't want to be dead. I wanted to live a full, rich inner life and experience things outside of my class, outside of the little domain I had grown up in. And so
I got the sense from, because I did read Hand to Mouth, that you sort of, not that you wanted to fail, but that you were willing to accept the possibility that life was going to be, you know, you weren't
Really
going to
tough.
have money.
Yes, yeah.
Life was going to be tough. You even made up this award in the school newspaper.
when I was in college, yes,
When
the
you were in
Christopher
college.
Smart Award.
Right, at Columbia, which my dad would have won.
Yes.
Which was for somebody who was just a complete
The biggest
screw
fuck up in
yeah.
this class.
Yeah, the biggest fuck up, and
Right.
he would have just
With
walked
the
away
person
with
with
it.
the most talent who had done the least with it.
But
That
so
was-
why this?
that was-
But why did you? I think your words were why did you sanctify failure? And maybe
Yes.
it has something to do with your dad's.
Maybe
Maybe.
it was an Oedipal drama being played out. Who
Yeah.
knows? But I realized that actually I was the winner of the contest. Not that no one applied, of course, but finally I was making up a contest in which I would be the winner because I was the biggest loser. It's complicated. Huh? But I understood that becoming a writer meant not making money. And so after I went to college, and these were tempestuous times in the 60s, I never had a white-collar job. I never wanted to work in an office. So I did things like work as a groundskeeper in a hotel one summer. And then after I got my MA from Columbia, imagine this, I got lucky. I had a connection, and I became a merchant marine. I was on an oil tanker for about 6 months in the Gulf of Mexico, meeting all kinds of crazy people, living a life that would have been unimaginable to me growing up, and how much I learned, from being with these men, and how rough they were and crazy. And I think all these experiences were fundamental towards creating what I would call a clear-eyed feel for everybody and not judging anybody. And the money I earned on the ship, I used to move to Paris. That's how I got to go to France, and where I spent 4 years really struggling, but somehow kept my head above water. But when I came back 3.5 years later, I had $9. That was it.
Oh, God.
And I was scrambling, and I was then 27 years old. So, it was a long, slow
Do you think it was luck,
apprenticeship.
or do you think? I mean, what do you think?
I just was so stubborn. I was
Right.
so stupid. And so I got back, 27 years old. I'd published 1 or 2 books of poetry. I had been writing things. I'd published a lot of translations. I was on my way to becoming a writer. And I had published 1 or 2 things in the New York Review of Books, even. It wasn't as if I wasn't doing it, but, 8 people knew that I was doing it.
What about? Can I just ask? What about? I want to ask a little bit about stories.
Well, just let me finish.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, just
Okay.
a thing, because this will sort of end the
Okay,
story.
okay.
So I got back to America, and my father, who always was just utterly mystified that he had created this poet for his son, he could only think about money and tennis. He loved tennis. And he said a very intelligent thing to me. He said, okay, I understand it. You're going to be a poet. I mean, there's no turning back. But can't you be a little more practical about it? Why don't you go back to school and get a PhD and become a professor? And then at least you can earn your living as you can write your, your poetry, which he always thought was a nice hobby for somebody, but not something that any man did in the world. And so I said, Dad, you have a point, and I'm gonna think about it. So I contacted some people, and I asked, so what's a really good place for literature, graduate school, and I was recommended to go to Princeton, and I had this connection. Robert Fagles, does his name mean anything?
No, actually.
The great translator of Virgil.
Oh,
and,
yeah,
and,
the
and
Fagel
Homer.
translation.
Yeah, Robert
Yeah.
Fagles,
Yeah.
a wonderful person. So I went in there feeling a little depressed because I really didn't like being a student. And but I had sent him my books and my essays along with my resume. And so we talked. He said, well, if you do this, you know, it's X number of years of classes, then you have to do your orals, and then you have to do this, and you write your PhD. It'll probably be, you know, 6 or 7 years before you get your PhD. I'm thinking, ay. But then Fagles put everything down. He said, you know what? I don't think you should do this. He said, I think you're a really talented young writer. I think you've got it. And don't do what I did. Don't get a PhD and hang out in a university all your life. Just keep doing what you're doing. And I thanked him. I left as if an enormous burden had been taken off my shoulders. And the irony was, about 10 years later, I got a job teaching at Princeton. You know, once a week, and we were colleagues. And every time I saw him, he said, I gave you some pretty good advice, didn't I?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So I wonder if, I mean, just to go back for a second to your dad about just that you tell a story in Hand to Mouth, and also it happens to the Archie, but I know how fiction works, you know, so it's not you, but I'm about him pretending he was so sort of, you know, boring in a way and predictable and sort of, well, in Hand to Mouth, that's how he comes across. But there was one incident where he pretended to amuse you, to be a big game hunter in South America, and that really stuck out in the memoir, because it's the only time, you know,
It's in The Invention of Solitude.
Yeah.
And he would tell really tall tales, my father, every once in a while. And he was always in the Andes prospecting for gold, or hunting lions in Africa. This was the kind of thing. You know, I loved it when he did that. That's when I felt closest to him, when he was telling stories. Interesting. Yeah.
Interesting, and also, I read somewhere that you started writing 4321, something to do with being the age that he was when he died.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? So
It was
maybe there was...
Strange moment. My father, who was in perfect health all his life, he never even had a cold, and he never drank, he never smoked, and he dropped dead at 66. And I was 66 when I started this book. And I don't know how many out there in the audience have lived to be older than their parents ever got to be. But I found it a very weird boundary to cross, to be older than my father ever was. And I guess when I was 66, I kept thinking, well, maybe I'm going to be struck down and killed any minute. And if I'm going to write this long book, I really better get down to it right away. And so I thought it would take me 5 or 6 years to finish. But I did it in such a focused way that it only took about 3.5. Because I worked all the time. I pushed everything in my life out of the way, except writing the book.
And how do you feel about the Archies? Do you feel like there's one soul to the Archies? Because as I was reading it, it's very interesting as a reader, because I didn't think of them as different guys. It was kind of one guy who was dealing with different fate options or whatever.
I agree with you. I think of them as the same. I mean, number one, I think, is the one who doubts himself the most. He has he lacks a self-confidence. I think they're all very bright boys. They're very gifted boys. And it's not a question of a handicap. But his father, in that version, is the one who runs into big problems with his business. And they're struggling. And Archie is a very conscientious, Archie 1, very conscientious kid. But he lacks the kind of vigorous, crazy self-involvement that would maybe take him to another level. Number 2, I think, is a battler. And someone, I don't want to talk about it too much, for whom great things are in store. Number 3 is the one most troubled, because in his case, his father dies when he's very young.
I love number 3.
Number 3 is
He
probably
really
the
did
one
it
I
for
love
me.
the best.
He was on fire.
Yeah, well, number 3 is, he's the fuck up. He's the one, but he's the one who evolves also. And I think he's in a way the most complex. Number 4 is the one most at odds with his family, the one who pretty much hates his father and is in conflict with him, and becomes very rigid and very dogged. And he's the one who becomes a writer. I think as time goes on, he begins to open up a bit. But there's a moment when he's an adolescent, when he's pretty insufferable, I think.
But he does write a wonderful story about Hank and Frank.
Yes, yes.
Which is this amazing, there's so many different stories within stories in all of your work.
He's
but
14.
It's great,
He
though.
writes a story about a pair of shoes, Hank and Frank.
It's really, that doesn't
I
do
loved
it credit.
writing it. I
It
loved
was wonderful.
getting in the mind of a 14-year-old, a bright, precocious 14-year-old. What would he write? And now his best friend has died,
Yes.
and so he's in mourning for this friend. But it all comes out in this strange story about the pair of shoes.
And what's interesting is it's not his words. The narrator tells the story,
Yes.
but he tells it in such great detail.
Yes.
So it's this kind of, that was what I was going to ask about, why are there so many writers writing in your work, which I love.
I don't know. I can never answer the question, why? I don't know if any novelist can. I can answer what, when,
Okay, so-
where, but why,
So
I
if
don't
it
know.
wasn't why are there so many writers writing? What place do you think writing has in writing?
Well, I think, in a way, in writing about writers, what I'm really writing about is consciousness. Thinking, people able to think about themselves and the world around them. It's not as though I think writing is something better than other work. I mean, for me, it was the work I wanted to do, but I can very well imagine why 99.9% of humanity would not want to spend their lives locked up alone in a room every day, putting words on pieces of paper.
Oh, absolutely.
I think there are other ways to live that are probably more satisfying. But you have to be, I think of writers as people with an illness.
It's kind of a compulsion.
And you can't help yourself. And you have to do that or else you won't be able to live. All artists, painters, musicians, writers, we're a damaged group. And, but I think we're the ones who maybe can bare our souls, for other people to look at their own souls. Isn't that what it's about, maybe?
Is it? Yeah, that
Maybe.
would, I think partly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
possibly.
And it's also about, because
I'm just winging it here,
Yeah,
so-
no, now I'm winging it too.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to wing
No.
it, but I am
Yeah.
now. But that's fine. But because that was something that I noticed as well, where someone in an interview said something about coincidences in your work, and you took a bit of offense, and you said they're not coincidences, they're the mechanics of reality.
Yes.
And I was struck because as I read through your novels, it's like there's something going on that doesn't go on in other novels, where the way events, they don't unfold, they fold.
Yeah.
It's kind of, as you're reading it, as a reader, something different happens to you as a reader, and it really is almost visceral. So I'm not going to ask you why,
Yeah.
but I do wonder what the heck is going on and what these mechanics of reality are.
Well, I'll tell you. And now, I mean, people always say, my work is involved with chance. I don't know. The new word I would use is the unexpected. And I think the unexpected is rushing in on us all the time. I mean, anyone who's lived the years that we've lived knows that even public events are unexpected. Things happen that no one can predict. And there we are, living with a new reality. It happens in our private lives, and it happens in the big world outside of us. So the unexpected is part of the fabric of reality, what I call the mechanics of reality. I think if a person doesn't take this into account, he or she is not really looking at the world as it works.
But as a writer of fiction, surely one of one's job is to, well, I don't know, is it to play God and to...
No, but I think a lot of novelists, maybe most novelists, have read too many books. And they normalize, and too many readers have read too many books of a certain kind that lead them to have certain kinds of expectations about what should happen in a book. But I think what on both sides, writers and readers, they've normalized existence. They've normalized human life into a box of possible and probable things. I'm interested in the improbable and the impossible because they happen with such regularity that, I mean, if you read my Red Notebook, you know, those are all true stories about truly bizarre things that have happened to me or to friends of mine or people I know. And I wrote those stories, this is back in the 90s, as a kind of ars poetica, without any theory. Just say, these are examples of what happens to ordinary people in the ordinary world. And what are you going to make of it?
So, for example, just you have, is that the one with the dime? Does the dime
Yeah,
have,
the dime is
okay,
in there.
so you lose a dime, somebody threw a dime to you out the window and you couldn't find it, and then you found a dime later in a different borough, and you were like, but it's the same dime.
It felt like the same dime.
I'm sure of it. But do you think that that's, well, I guess what I'm sort of getting at is, okay, so that's absolutely true. The unexpected does happen. And
Or that one about the Belgian prisoner of war in World War II. He was a man who spent 5 years in a German prison camp. And his guard was a pretty okay guy, even though he was a Nazi. He wasn't cruel, and it wasn't that they were friends, but he always felt that this guard treated him decently. So the war ends, they go back to their respective countries, they marry, they have kids, and then the kids grow up. One has a son, one has a daughter. The kids meet in a university, they get married, or they're going to get married, and then the two families meet, and then the guard and the prisoner suddenly walk into the room, recognize each other, and they're going to be in the same family now. And this is a real story. These things happen. Or the woman who married her brother without knowing it. These are true stories.
But are they... Is it, I mean, so it's not a coincidence.
No.
But it is how reality works. Yeah. But is it just randomness?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to put any theological interpretation on any of this. It's not mysticism. It's down to the ground reality.
And it is really fascinating because I think what you manage to do with your narratives is to actually, that's what I was trying to say in the beginning, is you kind of do remake the way one experiences reality because we're so used to grafting the traditional narrative onto reality that we think this happened because of that, but actually it doesn't.
No, causality is really hard to parse. I mean, this doesn't always lead to that.
No, but you've done a great thing in that you can tell a story and you can engage the reader while at the same time challenging our assumptions about how things work.
Well, I mean, don't we want to shake people up?
Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, you don't
definitely.
Want to be so complacent as to just give everybody what they think they want.
No, and it maybe if people, well, now it's the political environment, isn't it?
Now, I had a wonderful, life-changing conversation with a much older writer years ago, a French writer by the name of Edmond Jabès. I'm sure nobody here knows who he was, but he was a very great writer, I think, born in Egypt, a Jew who was kicked out in '56 and went to Paris and wrote a sequence of remarkable books. The first one being The Book of Questions. So he had written a little book called The Little Book of Subversion. And I was in Paris, and we had dinner together, and we were walking along the street afterwards and talking, and he said, you know, the aim of every writer is to subvert. I mean, this is what we do. This is why we do it. And I said, yes, I agree with you. And he said, but you see, a lot of writers misunderstand what this is all about. He said, if you're, say, a poet, and you think that by breaking up syntax and normal language sequences and splattering the words across the page, that you're making some revolutionary gesture about changing human consciousness, well, you're not, because no one's going to read it and no one cares. He said the only thing that is subversive, and this is what went right into me, is clarity. He said, think about Kafka. Is there any more subversive writer than Kafka? Does anyone write clearer sentences than Kafka? And this is why he haunts us, because of his clarity. And, well, the big light bulb went off in my head.
That's
and
amazing.
I think he's so right about that. And clarity is what I strive for always in my work.
But then there's the unconscious, which you
Yes.
can't control.
But I'm talking about on the level of the sentence.
Yes, oh,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and there's total clarity
Yeah.
through your works, and that stood out to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why you get the reader so close to you so easily, because we're just following you, even though we're going to places that are unexpected.
Yeah.
One sentence after the next. So yeah, it was actually one more thing was that you once said that the reader and the writer were two consciousnesses meeting. And then your partner, Suri Hustvedt, said, but it's also two unconsciousnesses meeting.
Well, Siri's so much smarter than I am.
I didn't say that. But I thought that was a really interesting thing to say, and I did notice there were I have one question, I don't know what you're going to think of this question,
Right.
but there were some characters that kept coming up, that there were these kind of golden boys, Aesop, Fanshawe, Art Fetterman, even Posey in the Music of Chance, and they're these Posey,
Yeah.
these kind of they're ethereal. And then there's the narrator who's sort of rescuing them in a way. And they have not supernatural powers, but they're very smart and very driven. And I was just kind of wondering, and in general, like, where do these characters come from?
Well, I think Fanshawe, from the locked room of the Music of is sort of roughly, more or less based on someone I went to high school with.
That was a person?
Yeah,
Wow.
a kind of, but the kind of person who could do anything. I've known a few of these boys, when I was younger. They were perfect students. They did everything in every subject. They excelled. Most people are good in, math or literature, but he, was perfect in everything. Plus, he was a tremendously good athlete. Of course, he went to Harvard, but there are these people, and
Did he end up being so subversive, as it were?
no, not at all. I mean, he's a professor of government at Harvard. Yeah, I mean, no, not so terribly interesting. But at the time, I thought he was destined to be some kind of genius who would break through all barriers and do something extraordinary that would change human life. But we all believe in our friends when we're young, don't we?
But it's also fascinating
Yes.
that then he appears as this sort of fascinating character
Yeah.
when in real life he turned out not to be.
Yeah, well, I used the young version of my friend, but then I dropped him and made Fanshawe into something else. But that's where he came from, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think now
Are we
you're gonna
running out
read-
of time
Now
already?
you have 10 minutes if you're going to read 10 minutes
Okay.
at the end.
All right. Boy, it goes fast, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So since we were talking about writing, and since we already know that Ferguson 4 wants to be a writer, I thought I would read this. It's in the middle of the book. And so how many pages is this? I read 2 before. This is 2, 4, 5. So a bit longer. But just to show how fanatical he is, doing things, again, that I never did. In his 3 years as a high school student in the New Jersey suburbs, The 16, 17, and 18-year-old Ferguson started 27 short stories, finished 19 of them, and spent no less than 1 hour every day with what he called his work notebooks, which he filled with various writing exercises he invented for himself in order to stay sharp, dig down, and try to get better, as he once put it to Amy, who's his stepsister. Descriptions of physical objects, landscapes, morning skies, human faces, animals, the effect of light on snow, the sound of rain on glass, the smell of burning wood, the sensation of walking through fog or listening to wind blow through the branches of trees. Monologues in the voices of other people in order to become those other people, or at least try to understand them better. His father, his mother, his stepfather, Amy, Noah, his teachers, his friends at school, Mr. and Mrs. Fetterman. But also unknown and more distant others, such as J.S. Bach, Franz Kafka, the checkout girl at the local supermarket, the ticket collector on the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad, and the bearded panhandler who cadged $1 from him in Grand Central Station. Imitations of admired, demanding, inimitable writers from the past. Take a paragraph from Hawthorne, for example, and compose something based on his syntactical model, using a verb wherever he used a verb, a noun wherever he used a noun, an adjective wherever he used an adjective, in order to feel the rhythms in your bones, to feel how the music was made. A curious sequence of vignettes generated by puns, homonyms, and one-letter displacements of words, ale, A-I-L, / ale, A-L-E, lost, lust, soil, soul, birth, B-I-R-T-H, birth, B-E-R-T-H. And impetuous jags of automatic writing to, quote, clear his brain whenever he was feeling stuck, as with a 4-page scribble gush inspired by the word nomad that began, "No, I am not mad, nor am I even angry, but give me a chance to discombobulate you, and I'll pick your pockets clean." He also wrote one one-act play, which he burned in disgust 1 week after finishing it, and 23 of the foulest stinker poems ever hatched by a citizen of the New World, which he tore up after promising himself never to write another poem again. He mostly hated what he did. He mostly thought he was stupid and talentless and would never amount to anything. But still he persisted, driving himself to keep at it every day in spite of the often disappointing results, understanding there would be no hope for him unless he kept at it, that becoming the writer he wanted to be would necessarily take years, more years than it would take for his body to finish growing. And every time he wrote something that seemed slightly less bad than the piece that had come before it, he sensed he was making progress, even if the next piece turned out to be an abomination. For the truth was that he didn't have a choice. He was destined to do this or die. Because notwithstanding his struggles and dissatisfaction with the dead things that often came out of him, the act of doing it made him feel more alive than anything else he had ever done. And when the words began to sing in his ears, and he sat down at his desk and picked up his pen or put his fingers on the keys of his typewriter, he felt naked and exposed to the big world rushing in on him. And nothing felt better than that. Nothing could equal the sensation of disappearing from himself and entering the big world humming inside the words that were humming inside his head. Stubborn. That was the word that best described him during those years. And every year more stubborn than the year before. More locked into himself, more unwilling to budge when someone or something pushed up against him. Ferguson had grown hard in his contempt for his father, hard in the abnegations he continued to impose on himself years after Artie Fetterman's death, hard in his opposition to the suburban society that had held him prisoner since the beginning of his conscious life. Ferguson hadn't yet turned into an insufferable scold, who made people flee from him the moment he walked into a room, it was because he didn't look for fights and generally kept his thoughts to himself. Most of his fellow high school students saw him as an okay sort of guy, a bit morose at times, a bit lost in his own head, but not someone with a chip on his shoulder, and definitely not a bore, since Ferguson wasn't against all people, only some people. And the people he wasn't against, he tended to like. And the people he liked, he treated with a reserved but thoughtful affection. And the people he loved in the way a dog loves, with every part of himself, never judging, never condemning, never thinking an ill thought, simply worshiping them and exulting in their presence. For he knew he was utterly dependent on the small band of people who loved him and whom he loved back, and that without them, he would have been lost. Another Hank or Frank, those are the shoes in his story, another Hank or Frank tumbling down the shaft of the all-devouring incinerator, a flake of ash floating across the night sky. He was no longer the boy who had written Soulmates, that's the shoe story, as a 14-year-old nitwit nobody. But he still carried that boy inside him, and he sensed that the two of them would go on walking together for a long time to come. To combine the strange with the familiar, that was what Ferguson aspired to do. To observe the world as closely as the most dedicated realist, and yet to create a way of seeing the world through a different, slightly distorting lens. For reading books that dwelled only on the familiar inevitably taught you things you already knew. And reading books that dwelled only on the strange taught you things you didn't need to know. And what Ferguson wanted above all else was to write stories that would make room not only for the visible world of sentient beings and inanimate things, but also for the vast and mysterious unseen forces that were hidden within the scene. He wanted to disturb and disorient, to make people roar with laughter and tremble in their boots, to break hearts and damage minds and dance the loony dance of the dizzy boys as they swung into their doppelganger duet. Yes, Tolstoy was ever so moving, and yes, Flaubert wrote the best sentences in creation. But much as Ferguson enjoyed following the dramatic, increasingly drastic turns in the lives of Anna K. and Emma B., at that moment in his life, the characters who spoke most forcefully to him were Kafka's K, Swift's Gulliver, Poe's Pym, Shakespeare's Prospero, Melville's Bartleby, Gogol's Kovalyov, and M. Shelley's Monster. Early efforts from his sophomore year, a story about a man who wakes up one morning to discover he has a different face. A story about a man who loses his wallet and passport in a foreign city and sells his blood in order to eat. A story about a little girl who changes her name on the first day of every month. A story about two friends who stop being friends because of a dispute in which both of their arguments are wrong. A story about a man who accidentally kills his wife and then decides to paint every house in his neighborhood a bright shade of red. A story about a woman who loses the power of speech and finds herself growing progressively happier as the years go on. A story about a teenage boy who runs away from home and then, when he decides to return, discovers that his parents have vanished. A story about a young man writing a story about a young man, writing a story about a young man, writing a story about a young man. Hemingway taught him to look at his sentences more carefully, how to measure the weight of each word and syllable that went into the building of a paragraph. But admirable as Hemingway's writing could be when he was writing at his best, his work didn't say much to Ferguson. All that manly bluster and tight-lipped stoicism seemed slightly ridiculous to him. So he left Hemingway behind for the deeper, more demanding Joyce. And then, when he turned 16, another bundle of paperbacks was given to him by Uncle Don, among them books by heretofore unknown Isaac Babel, who quickly became Ferguson's #1 short story writer in the world, and Heinrich von Kleist, the subject of Don's first biography, who quickly became Ferguson's number 2 short story writer, but even more valuable to him, not to say precious and everlastingly fundamental, was the 45-cent signet edition of Walden and Civil Disobedience that was wedged in among the books of fiction and poetry. For even if Thoreau wasn't a writer of novels or short stories, he was a writer of sublime clarity and precision, a creator of such beautifully constructed sentences that Ferguson felt their beauty as one feels a blow to the chin or a fever in the brain. Perfect. Every word seemed to fall perfectly in place, and every sentence seemed to be a small work unto itself, an independent unit of breath and thought. And the thrill of reading such prose was never knowing how far Thoreau would leap from one sentence to the next. Sometimes it was only a matter of inches, sometimes of several feet or yards, sometimes of whole country miles. And the destabilizing effect of those irregular distances taught Ferguson how to think about his own efforts in a new way. For what Thoreau did was to combine 2 opposing and mutually exclusive impulses in every paragraph he wrote, what Ferguson began to call the impulse to control and the impulse to take risks. That was the secret, he felt. All control would lead to an airless, suffocating result. All risk would lead to chaos and incomprehensibility. But put the 2 together, and then maybe you'd be onto something. Then maybe the words singing in your head would start to sing on the page, and bombs would go off, and buildings would collapse, and the world would begin to look like a different world. But there was more to Thoreau than just style. There was the savage need to be himself, and no one but himself, even at the cost of offending his neighbors. The stubbornness of soul that so appealed to the ever more stubborn Ferguson, the adolescent Ferguson, who saw in Thoreau a man who had managed to remain an adolescent for his entire life, which is to say, a man who had never abandoned his principles, who had never turned into a corrupt, sellout grown-up, a brave boy to the bitter end, which was precisely how Ferguson wanted to imagine his own future. But beyond the spiritual imperative to transform himself into a bold, self-reliant being, there was Thoreau's critical examination of the American premise that money rules all, the rejection of the American government, and his willingness to go to jail in order to protest that government's actions. And then, of course, there was the idea that it changed the world, the idea that it helped make India an independent country 5 months after Ferguson was born, which was the same idea now spreading across the American South, and perhaps would help change America as well. Civil disobedience, non-violent resistance to the violence of unjust laws, and how little had changed in the 112 years since Walden, Ferguson told himself. The Mexican-American War now turned into the Vietnam War. Black slavery now turned into Jim Crow oppression and Klan-run state governments. And just as Thoreau had written his book in the years leading up to the Civil War, Ferguson felt that he too was writing at a moment when the world was about to blow apart again. And 3 times in the weeks both before and after his mother married Jim and Amy's father, as he watched the televised images and studied the newspaper photographs of Buddhist monks in South Vietnam burning themselves to death to protest the policies of the American-backed Diem regime, Ferguson understood that the quiet days of his boyhood were over, that the horror of those immolations proved that if men were willing to die for peace, then the steadily expanding war in their country would eventually become so big that it would obscure everything and end up making everyone go blind.